By 1943, the Allied powers of Britain, the USA and the USSR were starting to have their own successes in the war. The German and Italian armies surrendered in North Africa in May 1943, whilst on the Eastern Front German forces suffered disastrous defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk. At a meeting between the Allied powers in December 1943, the Soviet President Stalin felt that his country was bearing a disproportionate burden of the fighting. He pushed Churchill and Roosevelt for a second front to be opened in the war against Hitler. They soon agreed, and in late 1943 began the secret preparations for military landings in France, codenamed Operation Overlord. Throughout 1944, aerial photographs mapping the coastline of France were taken. Inflatable dummy tanks were positioned along the south coast of England to fool Hitler into believing that an attack would be launched from Dover on the French port of Calais. This ploy was to fool Hitler until the morning of the landings themselves, which became known as D-Day. On the 6th of June 1940, Allied forces landed on the largely unsuspecting beaches of Normandy in France and began the campaign to liberate Western Europe from German occupation. British and Canadian forces landed on beaches codenamed Sword, Juno and Gold, whilst US forces landed at Omaha and Utah beaches. The Allies were quickly able to establish a fortified position, or beachhead, and although pinned down in Normandy for almost a month, they eventually broke out and reached Paris within 6 weeks. Hitler now faced the prospect of war on two fronts, with the Allies pushing into Germany from both east and west. The success of D-Day was due to a combination of factors. 1. Preparation. The Allies had prepared very thoroughly for the invasion. Churchill delayed the assault until he felt the time was right. Allied troops were trained in landing tactics and new devices were developed to assist in the landings. These included artificial piers and harbours and an oil supply pipeline across the channel. Number 2. Surprise. The Germans did not know where the landings would take place. Indeed, Allied ploys to trick Hitler into believing that the landings would take place in Calais worked so well that the Germans were sure that any landings would occur there. Even on the day of the invasion, Hitler thought that the landings themselves were a decoy for a later landing, and he was slow to send reinforcements. Number 3. Control of the air. The Allies had complete control of the air over the Channel in northern France on the day of the invasion. Over 10,000 Allied planes escorted the invasion fleet to France. Additionally, Allied planes also prepared the way by bombing key enemy positions and carrying paratroopers behind enemy lines. Number 4. Hitler's decisions. Hitler refused to allow Field Marshal Rommel to take control of the Panzer tank divisions in Normandy. This weakened the German army when it tried to counterattack the Allies after they had landed. Despite initial successes on D-Day, it took a further 11 months for Germany to be entirely defeated. The American army decided to advance along a broad front rather than make a concentrated attack on the Germans, which might overstretch supply lines and risk Allied forces being cut off by a German counterattack. The British did attempt to speed up the advance through the Arnhem operation of September 1944. 30,000 airborne troops were landed in the Netherlands, miles behind German lines, in a mission codenamed Operation Market Garden. However, the British failed to capture and hold a key bridge in the Dutch town of Arnhem. All units were forced to pull back after suffering heavy losses, and the operation ended in failure. In December 1944, Hitler made his last attempt to defeat the Allies in the West. His offensive was made through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and achieved total surprise. German troops made rapid advances and created a bulge in US lines. There was savage fighting around Bastogne, where US forces were surrounded, but eventually German forces ground to a halt. Allied air superiority played a major role, and by the end of January 1945 the Germans were forced to withdraw to their own defensive lines. The Germans lost around 100,000 troops in the attack, meaning that the German army could no longer hold the Allied advance, and in March 1945 US troops crossed the River Rhine into Germany. On the Eastern Front too, the German army was faltering as Soviet forces made rapid advances towards Germany. By mid-April 1945, Soviet forces had liberated Poland, Hungary and Austria and were preparing for their final assault on the German capital Berlin. On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in Berlin as Soviet troops continued their attack on the capital. The Soviet Union finally took complete control of Berlin on the 2nd of May 1945. With German forces defeated and Berlin captured, the remnants of the German army offered the unconditional surrender of Germany on the 8th of May 1945. This date became known as Victory in Europe, or VE Day, sparking mass celebrations across Western Europe and the United States.